unSILOed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to unSILOed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Hein de Haas, who is a professor of sociology at the University of Amsterdam, and used to be at Oxford, been studying migration for basically your entire career. Although I think, it sounds like you almost did anthropological research when you were in Morocco. I don't know what the boundary line is between sociology and anthropology, but you did say at the beginning of the book that this book, which is called How Migration Really Works, has to lean on all sorts of different disciplines in order to understand the phenomenon of migration. So first of all, welcome, Hein.
Thanks for inviting me.
Now, look, this book, How Migration Really Works, even though it is, I think, primarily focused on what we might think of as recent events, you're contextualizing it by comparing it to migration patterns in the past. And, the thing about humans is that humans have been moving around, for as long as we've been humans. Obviously, we all came out of Africa, but when you read about some of these hunter-gatherers and the mixing and we certainly got the nomadic tribes, coming into Europe and so forth. And I have no idea where the Dutch people originated, but I'm sure it is not somewhere where they currently live. And so I guess the first question I have for you is, we talk a lot about migration, particularly international migration. Is it really something that is on the rise? Is it one of these things like crime where everybody thinks it's on the rise, but it's actually not really on the rise?
Well, neither migration nor crime is on the rise, globally speaking, that is for sure. Now, what's happened to migration? You're right. I think the most fundamental problem that my book tries to address is that we have denormalized our view on migration. To me, it sounds like a huge cliche to say migration is of all times, but we got rid of that very fundamental insight. Now, that doesn't mean that migration can't bring problems, but that's a very different discussion. But what you see in politics is a lot of wishful thinking, illusion politics. But what I find so astonishing in particular is that, whereas you could say of economic policy, most policymakers, whether it's high inflation, they would listen to experts, right? Should we raise the interest rates or not, or things like that? There is some discussion. There can be disagreement. But on migration, we barely have ever a real serious discussion about indeed how it works. That's why I called my book How Migration Really Works, but particularly what policies are successful or not. And what I observe in my book is that both in the US, but also across the Atlantic in Europe, politicians have been basically in denial for over the last 4 to 5 decades about the realities of migration. And that's the reason why these policies always fail. And so it's a lack of fundamental understanding of migration as a social and economic process that needs to obviously be the foundation of any policy. And the migration issue has been completely hijacked by politicians. Pro and anti-migration debates in a very simplistic way that don't really engage with the realities of migration. I think it's that huge gap that is really the problem. Now, with regards to do we have more migrants or not, for the US, for sure, that's not true. If you go back a century, of course, relative to population and absolute numbers, there's more migrants in the US, but the percentage, I think roughly 15% of US population is foreign-born. That was roughly the same a century ago. Of course, there was a time, with high protectionism, 2 world wars, when those numbers went down, but it went up again after the war. But a fundamental thing changed, I think, in the world, and that is really, if you look at the global migration map. So if we talk about numbers, on the total world population, we talk about 3 to 3.5% of the world population is a migrant, and that number hasn't really moved much. But of course, big things have changed in the global sort of geography of migration. And that is primarily linked to the fundamentally changed position of Europe on the global migration map. So as I argue in my book, over the last 5 centuries until the Second World War, basically, it were Europeans who moved out as colonists, as missionaries, as soldiers, as normal migrants to the Americas, obviously. So it's been going on for centuries, right? After the Second World War, that stopped with the end of colonialization, but also growing welfare in Europe. Europeans lost the appetite for emigrating. So for Europe, it meant that Europe transformed, let's say the former colonizing nations, France, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, they flipped around in their position on the map in terms of migration. They used to be the big emigration countries. They suddenly started to draw in migrants because of labor shortages, mainly from former colonies, but also countries that didn't have colonies like Germany, from Turkey and North Africa. So that is how Europe got confronted with a new reality. Migration is not new in Europe, but it were mainly Europeans moving within Europe, right? But then more and more non-European migrants came. For the US, it has fundamental implications too, because to be an immigration country, that's in the DNA of America, that's never been a real question. But of course, the composition of migration completely changed since the late 1960s. There is very few Europeans anymore. I think less than 10% of new immigrants is from Europe in the US. And so the character of immigration to the United States completely changed. So it is not really about numbers, it's really about the racial, ethnic background of migrants.
Well, I mean, it seems like the vast majority of migration is within borders. And so, we don't seem to pay as much attention to that. I mean, if you look at what's happened in China, I mean, there's been massive migration from rural areas to the cities. In Africa, you see the same thing. And I guess that's not something that, in the West, that happened a while ago, right? That happened a long time ago. And so we kind of forget that is really the most important form of migration.
Yeah, we totally forget about our own past. And you're totally right. So there are different estimates of the number of so-called internal migrants, or people moving from inland rural areas to mostly coastal urban areas, like former peasants that find better jobs in factories, for instance. That happened in the past in Europe too, and in America, obviously. So that's been a universal sort of process linked to modernization, industrialization. What it proves, you cannot think away migration. I mean, you may like migration or not, but if you're going to have this modernization process, you're going to have people leaving rural areas, going to urban areas. So that is 4/5, perhaps, of total mobility in the world is within borders. And it's only this 3.5%. We can haggle endless about statistics, but it's a fairly small percentage of people who crosses borders. And to give you one statistic to really show how unimportant, in a way, international mobility is, there are at least 300 million migrants within China. That is more migrants than international migrants in the world, just in China. So the real transfer of population historically, if you look at Europe and the United States, but more recently in low and middle income countries, has really been about this large scale transfer of economic activities and people from rural to urban areas.
And I mean, look, when people migrate, I mean, it's an investment decision, right? I mean, it's a choice. It's an economic choice. And I think this has been obfuscated, for maybe a number of reasons. I mean, there's hysteria around refugees, but then there's also, I think, a desire for people who are advocates of migrants to portray them as refugees, because in the political climate, I guess the belief is that that's more likely to lead to sympathy or acceptance, right? But I mean, it seems like when people are migrating, I mean, they're primarily thinking about opportunities. They're primarily thinking about, giving their kids an opportunity, giving themselves an opportunity, earning extra income that they can send back to their families and so forth, right?
Yeah, I mean, you're totally right. I think there is still this image, particularly when we talk about so-called South-North migration, so people moving in from Latin America to the US or crossing the Mediterranean from Africa to Europe. There is this big image of desperate departures, people fleeing their countries because of poverty, violence, famine, climate change. And what I find interesting is that both on, let's say, the left and on the right, sort of more extreme sides of the political spectrum, there is this apocalyptic view on migration. Because on the left, you can hear these stories about, climate change and world hunger and wars. More and more people are on the drift. Hundreds of millions of people will crush into our shores if we don't do anything about those problems. And of course, on the far right, but these narratives have become more mainstream, obviously, the idea of this massive invasion, and it's just too many people. What I found interesting is that on both sides, It sounds very different because indeed on the left you'll it's more likely to hear those victimhood stories. These are poor refugees. We need to help them. We need to solve problems. We need to provide development aid. We need to fight climate change. I'm not saying I'm all against that, but then it's presented as a solution to migration, right? And on the right, actually also tap into this idea of this it's just too many, these big waves coming our way. But their reaction would rather be, we need to crack down even more on border controls. It's just too many. We cannot help the whole world kind of narrative. And remember that Donald Trump in his previous term was referring to shithole countries. Well, there was a lot of outrage about it, but I think that's the way actually many people think, but don't dare to say it aloud. So that there's this idea of, this pool of misery in Central American countries or in Africa, and these people are washing up on our shores. When you look at research, you get a totally different picture. First of all, theory, already we know that, like you were saying, migrants look for opportunities in general. It is not untrue that issues like instability, violence may, of course, prompt people to move. We talk about refugees. That is certainly not a majority, but even refugees will think about where to go. And there you see that migration is an investment. So the poorest of the poorest can't migrate, certainly not over long distances. And the research really shows that for most migrants, they see migration as an investment in the future of their family. And this is very much linked to labor opportunities. So we have actually done quantitative research on this, on how does inequality drive migration, and we didn't find much. With inequality as such, people are not going to migrate because there's GDP, average GDP or income or salary difference between the US and Mexico. And that's what you see when an economic crisis happens. Barely anybody would migrate. When the Spanish economy was in tatters after the 2007-2008 crisis, no Moroccans would even think about going to Spain because everybody knew there were no jobs. So this is why I said in my book, by far the most effective way to bring down migration is to wreck your economy. And the fact that we had such a huge spike in migration after COVID, both to the US and Europe, had a lot to do, apart from refugees coming in from Venezuela in the case of the Americas and Ukraine in the case of Europe, really to do with this huge labor crunch we had. Many native workers no longer went back to those jobs. And we reached unprecedented numbers of open job vacancies in the US. And that is already, as I read an interesting paper, also, it partly also explains the big hike in illegal border crossings. So the labor market actually drives, so that you could say the supply is quasi-unlimited, but most people wouldn't. It is very costly to migrate. It will cost you thousands of dollars to cross a border. You're not going to do that generally if you don't think there's some opportunity. And that is, I think, the organized hypocrisy in which we have been for the last 4 decades. Now, we're all open to skilled workers, right? We have special visa schemes. And again, I think this administration will actually expand the number of skilled visa and the golden visa. But when you talk about lower skilled labor, I think that's where the big taboo is. And everybody knows that there is many sectors that are completely dependent on cheap migrant labor, whether these people have papers or not, but there is no political acknowledgement of this reality. And that is what I find astonishing also in the United States. That I wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal last year where I tried to argue that we will never solve the border crisis if we don't look at the reality of labor in the US. And in any successful immigration policy, needs to have some coherence between your immigration rules and how you run your economy, because we all know that there is no real willingness to deport all those undocumented workers that work in agriculture in California, for instance. And that's an open secret. And I think that's where it really goes wrong, this absolute denial of reality on both sides of the political spectrum.
Yeah, so much there. First of all, the fact that immigration is expensive, it requires a lot of upfront investment. Now, of course, you talk also in the book about how potential migrants can get access to credit to make this happen. But whether it's access to the resources of your family or whether it's access to some credit network, those things are only available to people who are moderately well off. Yes, my ancestors fled the Irish potato famine, way back when, but they weren't the poorest of the poor. They weren't the people that had already squandered all of their resources staying alive. They still had plenty of resources to pay for passage. And so I think one of the insights that you point to is this idea that so many people have, if we foster development, that this will somehow, keep people back in their home countries. In fact, it'll just give them the capital to make the investment, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is why there is this dominant model, which some call a theory, but I think is a quasi-theory, the so-called push-pull model. Is this idea you have this poverty push and people are being driven off their land. But we just know from very good research is that the relation between development and levels of outmigration is totally nonlinear, which means if, very roughly speaking, if countries move from low to middle-income country, lots of people are going to move. Primarily from rural to urban areas, but some of that mobility will spill over borders. So this is the so-called non-linearity of that relationship. Only when countries really become wealthier, then of course people will find more opportunities in their own countries. I mean, Mexico is in that trajectory. Mexico no longer has the immigration rates they used to have, and it's becoming an immigration country. Ireland is not a great example of a big immigration country that has become an immigration country, but the least migratory region of the world, this is sub-Saharan Africa, not coincidentally, because most people are too poor to migrate over long distances. And that is the big, so we really have to, and this is also what I'm trying to argue in my book, we need a new paradigm, a new theory on migration. That migration is part of development. So this is not about liking migration or not, or to deny that migration can also lead to tensions and problems, but it is, if you deny that fundamental reality, you also see it in middle-income countries that many governments have tried to stop or curb rural to urban migration. It has all failed. I can give you an example. Some governments have tried to build nice roads to those rural areas. It often has sped up the migration from rural to urban areas because you open up the hinterland. It's an unstoppable process. Some people said, oh, you bring schools to poor areas. Well, for kids, perhaps it will help them to stay a bit longer in the village. But as soon as you have your high school diploma, your aspirations have totally changed. You probably no longer want to be a peasant, and you may want to pursue another degree or a job in the city. So it's not just about money, it's also about cultural change. And in that sense, it's inevitable. And internationally speaking, like we said before, I mean, quite famous name in migration studies is an MIT economist, Michael Pioro, who wrote back in 1979 already a book. And he was looking at Mexicans in the US and Puerto Ricans in the US that say it's an illusion. Already at the time, there were debates about we need to develop Mexico so less Mexicans will come. He said, if you look at the history of US immigration, employers have always switched to a new source of labor. Because what basically happened in the US, if you just look very broadly over the 20th century, of course, until let's say the 1920, it still mainly relies on migration from Europe. When that tails off for various reasons, they start to recruit people from the US South. So internal migrants, African Americans who moved to the North. When that source ran dry in the economic boom, late 1930s, conscription for the Second World War, then the US started to recruit in 1942. Purposefully in Mexico, workers. So I say, but they will just shift to a new source of workers. It's really the demand, the labor demand that is leading. It's not third world poverty, and people will not generally migrate in big numbers if there's no real opportunities in destination countries.
What I find fascinating is that within the U.S., internal migration has more or less slowed down. I mean, it's lower than it ever has been in our history. The exception, of course, is immigrants, right? So immigrants seem to be more willing to pick up and move to where the opportunities are, whereas native-born Americans are very reluctant to, particularly the ones who are sort of in the lower income brackets. I mean, this seems puzzling. I mean, do we have a theory that accounts for that? I mean, look, I know that getting up and leaving your community and leaving your family and so forth is tough and difficult. But I mean, it's got to be harder to leave your community in Guatemala than to leave your community in Ohio, right? So, but why is it that, here in San Francisco, we have tons of people from all over the world, right, coming to do some of these jobs, but, very few people are coming from, say, West Virginia or from Ohio, right? How do we explain it?
Well, I mean, what is interesting, if you only look at migration, you only get half the picture, right? If you want to understand people's migration decisions, you also have to understand people who decide not to go. And there's a huge home preference for people. People are willing to forgo significant increases in income. They prefer to stay at home. You really need to have a big incentive. And of course, if you are from a rural community in Guatemala, and you can increase your income by fivefold, for instance, by moving to the US. That means a much bigger change. So those people will be way more motivated in terms of the multiplier, in terms of income and opportunities. So what you could say more generally in the Western world, we see mobility going down. That's, by the way, interesting. Many people think that technology speeds up migration. Well, if you look at it scientifically, there are many reasons why technology leads to less migration than to more migration. Because, hey, we can just commute. And these days we can often say, if you're in particular service jobs, you can stay at home. We can trade, obviously. We can move the factories and the farms to the cheap labor, which has massively happened in the past few decades. So there are many reasons, and that's actually what we see in Western, let's say, industrialized societies, that less people want to move. We have it pretty good, most people. It is good enough not to have this incentive to move. If you're in a small village in Guatemala or Senegal, and you're amongst the sort of local middle class, you have to choose the choice to, work in a city in your own country or move to Europe or the US, and you can multiply your incomes by many times. Of course, it's a huge draw. And the other thing is that employers will always tell you those migrants are way more motivated. So the interesting thing is that migrants don't take away jobs, they fill in vacancies that native workers no longer want to fill. And I think that is the real conundrum. Politicians will always say we need to put our own workers to work, but when we try, there was this anecdote I have in my book about Brexit and the COVID crisis. And there was a huge shortage in the middle of COVID of agricultural workers. And then
they tried to get British people to go.
Yes, there was this video by the then Prince Charles to say what was the title? Pick for Britain, calling upon Brits to work in agriculture. Nobody showed up, and that's the story you will always hear, because people basically are no longer motivated, and this has to do with job status. And I think another thing, what it actually tells us, I think it would be very naive to think that any high-income country will never have immigration. I mean, all high-income countries have a significant level of immigration. But I think you can also say that the kind of job markets we have created with a lot of these unattractive, temporary, badly paid jobs, of course, are going to draw in even more migrants, because we created a lot of jobs that native workers simply no longer want to do. So it's not so migration has created a situation, but we created an economic system in a job market that is very dependent on this precarious kind of labor that no native workers want to do.
But I think one thing that has changed is that, we sort of have created a system where if you're going to migrate, it's kind of like a permanent thing. I mean, when I moved to California from Virginia, I knew that I could just sort of go back and forth, and if things didn't work out, I could leave. And, I didn't really think twice about it. And I think people who were from Mexico working in agriculture 100 years ago, they would come up and go back, and they would kind of move with the tides. And I think most of the people who went to Argentina from Italy and America from Italy had every intention of flowing back to their country once they...
Many went back, actually. Yeah.
But now we sort of have a system where we frown on that kind of back and forth flow. And when we sort of say, if you're here, you're here, right? I mean, does that actually kind of paradoxically increase the number of permanent immigrants?
We've studied this also in an econometric study. We have looked at thousands of migration flows over several years, and we have studied the effect of an introduction of a visa, for instance, in a previously free migration corridor. What many people forget is that, let's say, before 1986, although not completely legal, it was fairly easy to travel back and forth between Mexico and the US. And the same for Spain, Morocco. It's just 20 kilometers across the Strait of Gibraltar. There were no visa systems. There were barely any controls. So most of those workers, North African workers to Europe and Mexican workers to the US, we call this circulation. They would just go back and forth. So you pick up a job, you work for a few years or months, and you go back. And when you lose your job, why would you stay in the US? You go back, right, to your family, because you can go back. What we actually measured, and this is many migration corridors that are well established, if you introduce a restriction, you end up with more migrants. because the effect on reducing inflows is lower than on reducing return flows. And this is the science of migration, I always say, because many people don't believe me. I say, well, if you really want to understand how a border policy influences migration, you shouldn't only be focused on the number of people coming in, because everybody's obsessed with that, right? How many people coming in? But what we know is that a border keeps more people often in the US than it actually keeps people out or into Europe, particularly when the causes of migration are still there. For instance, those jobs. People will keep on coming in, but the more difficult you make it to come, the less likely migrants are to go back. So that shows what a fundamental dilemma this is for government. Because on the one, if you want to control immigration, which I kind of understand for a sovereign state, you want to have some idea who's coming in, it is not, you cannot reconcile that with the idea of stimulating return. So you can't have your cake and eat it too. So you either have an open migration system where people just go back and forth, or you put in severe immigration restrictions, but you run the risk of the policy completely backfiring. And I think the US-Mexican case is the best example, has been very well studied by some renowned US sociologists who've tracked this migration for many years. And what the increasing border enforcement ever since the IRCA Act in 1986 have done is turning a circular flow of Mexicans, mainly going to a few US states on the border, into a permanently settled population of about 11 million people. That's also how European restrictions basically locked in the guest workers. And what then happens is what I call the migration multiplier. So if you're a young man or woman working for a few years and you want to go back, but suddenly the border is shut, you're going to stay put. When the crisis hit Spain, all the European workers went back because they have free migration, but all the Moroccan and Ecuadorian workers stayed put. What do migrants, if their perspective change? Because most migrants will leave. It's an investment, right? To earn some money to build up, something back home, like a small enterprise or buy a nice house or send your kids to college, something like that. That's what most migrants aim to do. Or pay your medical bills and things like that. Once you shut the border, many migrants, of course, migrants are not stupid. They think, well, I'm going to stay put because I may run the risk if I go back that I'm not be able to re-migrate. What do most migrants do once they decide to stay? They bring over their families. And this is how, for instance, in Europe, quite small numbers of guest workers at some point through the sort of border enforcement and increasing immigration restrictions over the 80s and 90s decided to stay, bring over their families. Same happened in the US to the Mexicans.
Yeah, I think you said in your fieldwork in Morocco, you met a lot of these older people who would kind of, go over every year for some period of time, do some work, and then come back. And
very relaxed system, yeah. Like within countries, right? So one of those paradoxes, this is really how we really dug a huge hole for ourselves as Western societies, because why on earth would we think that the same policies that failed us over the last 40 years will work this time around? I think it's insane. Insanity is sometimes defined, I think, as trying to do the same over and over and over again and expect different results. What I say, well, no matter whether you like migration or not, or whether you like more or less migration, you should at least be interested in why the policies fail. And it's complex. And there are no easy solutions for complex migration problems. So that migration does also can cause problems in places where migrants concentrate, and that not everybody is happy about it, particularly because employers reap the biggest benefits of that cheap labor. I can fully understand that. But the kind of solutions that politicians, sell to us have more to do with bold acts of political showmanship than any really serious effort to control and manage migration.
Well, look, a lot of people would say, well, look, we have had lots of immigration in the past, but things are different now, right? So, yeah, we had all sorts of Italians and Irish and Jews and Slavs coming into America back in, the late 19th century. But oh my gosh, these people from Syria and from Guatemala, they're like completely different. So, I don't know whether we have an objective measure of quote difference, but I can't imagine that someone from the shtetl, showing up in Chicago is going to find it to be more similar than someone who comes from Syria, who probably, listens to Taylor Swift, like watches CNN and stuff. Is is there any logic to that? I mean, does that actually track? I mean, that there is like more cultural diversity now than there was in previous times?
Well, unless you define diversity only in terms of skin color, then there is no real case to be made. It is quite astonishing if you go back indeed a century ago in the US, who migrant groups that are seen as completely American these days, as American as apple pie, as the Americans say, were seen as the unassimilable other or danger. Of course, Jews, Eastern European Jews, but also Catholics, but even Germans. So, and it is quite. There were serious discussions in the US, I think a century ago, whether Sicilians were black or white and things like that. And they were seen as fundamentally hostile. There were serious sociologists even that were calling upon the US government to clean the scum of the melting pot. That's how they would call it. And they were saying those Eastern European migrants are committing race suicide by letting those people in. So very difficult to imagine now, but Jews and Irish and Southern Europeans were not seen as white. They were not seen as fitting into the American mainstream, which at that time was, of course, very much defined by being Anglo-Saxon, or at least Northwestern European and Protestant, obviously. And anybody who fell out of that category was seen as hostile. It's also interesting how Catholics were always accused of being more loyal to the Pope in Rome than to their new adopted home nation. So a lot of narratives you hear now about other groups, right? About loyalty, lack of loyalty, and danger from within, a cultural threat, have been repeated for so many different groups in the past. So the target is just changing. And I think it's perhaps a little bit over the peak in the US, but pundits like Pat Buchanan have written books about the third world invasion of the United States, and they were talking about Latinos. So this idea that Latinos are taking over in America, so these ideas have been repeated over and over and over again. And in the US, they have been very much, of course, last few decades, targeted towards Latino migrants, particularly Mexicans, and in Europe, more and more towards Muslim immigrants. So these are like new targets, but the narratives are remarkably similar. I mean, it also astonishes me when you think about the Irish, they were really seen as a different people, a different race, not fitting into the mainstream culture. And the fact that when John F. Kennedy was elected US president, it was still a huge thing that he was Roman Catholic. It's almost unimaginable. People would now see that as something unprecedented. So our idea of diversity has changed, and we have become blind to diversity of the past. That's basically what happened.
Yeah, but is Europe different? I mean, in the U.S., okay, we have a history of this. You can become an American just by, wearing the flag and singing the songs and eating the pie and so forth. But I mean, to become Dutch, to become German, to become Italian, I mean, the national identity is built on the nation, right? On the ethnicity. And so immigration something that is more difficult for those societies to deal with? I mean, England's a special case because it's phenomenal how England has kind of become, an immigrant-based country in ways that no other European country seems to have succeeded in doing. But I mean, is there something different about the nature of identity in continental Europe from?
Well, migration is not new, but I think the national identity in Europe in most European countries has been more tied up with the idea, but obviously it's a myth, of a single origin, that there's the real original Dutch or there's the real original German, whereas we know that the European history is full of migrations as well, obviously. And, when the Dutch Republic in the 17th century rose to world power, it drew in a lot of migrants, and also Jewish migrants, from all across the Mediterranean. And they weren't seen as typically Dutch at the time, but of course they became Dutch over time. And there are many similar examples. So migration is not new, but it's never been part of our nation building history. So in the United States, what strikes me is that nobody would deny that the US is an immigration country. People may say there's too many illegal migrants or the wrong migrants, but the very fact that the US is an immigration country is just in the DNA of the US. I think what you see in Europe has gone through a long period of denial, yet that in countries like Britain as well, I think in the past, and France and Germany and the Netherlands, you would hear politicians until the 1990s at least, making official statements. We are not an immigration country. in clear defiance of reality, obviously, you don't hear that much. So I think very gradually European countries are coming to terms with the new reality, but it always takes time for ideologies and politicians to adapt to those new realities. But I do agree with you that European nations generally have more difficulties recognizing that fact, because many of these nations have been built on this idea of one single ethnic origin. But these are, of course, no historical realities. These are ideologies, but they're quite strong, and you see a huge resistance there.
Well, I mean, this whole idea of assimilation and melting pot, I mean, this also has peculiar political valences, right? So on the one hand, the right-wing folks will say, these folks can never be assimilated. But there's also kind of a leftist position, which is, and why should they, right? And so, a lot of people say, well, there's the banlieue in France where, they're not becoming fully French. And then, in Germany you had the Gastarbeiters. And so I think it was Angela Merkel who said multiculti doesn't work anymore. And so, I mean, this idea of kind of separate but equal, I mean, is this a left thing or a right thing, or has there been a rise and fall in this idea of, separate hybrid identities in different European?
It's a really interesting topic. When I was looking into this, being European myself, I also got confused. Initially, there was a chapter in my book that cost me most time of all chapters to get my head around this integration and multiculturalism thing. But when I started to study the histories of the multiculturalism, it's actually interesting to find out this actually started in the 1970s and 1980s. And originally, the multiculturalism is this idea you have a policy of a government where you stimulate migrant groups to, in a way, hold on a bit to their culture of origin and try to give them some subsidies, to not push them too hard to assimilate. Originally, and that's the irony, those policies were introduced to prepare guest workers, including their kids, on their eventual return to the homeland. So actually, they were originally designed as anti-assimilation measures, giving a clear signal to those workers, you will never be part of Germany or France or the Netherlands. Later on, the purpose was completely turned around. These policies were solved to encourage integration with preservation of all your own identity. Well, but when you look at it more critically, this was a form of, I call it apartheid light in my book, basically to send a message to migrant communities. Well, you're welcome here and you can stay here for a while, but you'll never be really fully German, or you'll never be really fully Dutch. And this was in the same period when we had this series of recessions in the 1980s, and lots of these groups became unemployed. And it was a perfect recipe for segregation and the integration problems we have actually seen. So the interesting thing is that the policy wasn't left or right wing. It was broadly shared by a political class that wasn't ready at that time to acknowledge the permanency of that immigration. And I think this is a theme we see coming back again and again and again. Nobody in the US believes that any US government will ever deport 12 or so million undocumented migrants. What we see right now on television is a lot of symbol policies, a lot of noise. We may have a slight hike in deportations, but nobody's going to believe we're going to deport that entire workforce. And I think the longer we wait, finding solutions for those groups that we know have been there for a very long time, that won't go back eventually, whether we talk about undocumented migrants or marginalized legal migrant groups or refugees, the refusal to acknowledge that these people won't go back is actually creating the segregation problems for the future. So it's this lack of political responsibility taking that we're really suffering from. And I think is keeping that cycle going in which we have been for the last almost half century now.
Yeah, I'm guessing that the Germans did not have these multiculti policies for the ethnic Germans coming from Romania or from Russia. They didn't just say, okay, we're going to preserve your Russianness, right? They're like,
no, you're totally expected to assimilate. What I find most migrants actually want to integrate, and the irony is that, for instance, in my country, the government still hasn't set up a decent national system of language training, and I think it's still I think it's quite outrageous. But I think it speaks to a history of us being, I call this the European reluctant immigration countries. Well, that's perhaps not true for America's self-image, but it is certainly true for the lower skilled workers whose vital contribution to the US economy is systematically denied. And I know the narrative, right? People say, well, these people have been here against the law and things like that, and I understand that. But if you have tolerated those groups for so long in the US to contribute to the US economy, I think, morally speaking, you have no longer a case.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's peculiar how the opposition to immigration is primarily targeting the low-income people and not the high-income people, right? So, here in the U.S., and I think there is a big political divide right now in the administration where you have a strong component primarily from the tech sector that are pushing for more immigration, while Trump is saying less immigration. I mean, is it simply that they are going to agree to let in more high skill and keep low skill folks out? So I don't know. It's peculiar. I mean, is the belief that the high income people are somehow contributing more financially than the low income people are? And is there any evidence to support that?
Not really. I mean, of course, if you look at people's contributions fiscally, of course, higher skilled migrants contribute more, but it's also true for native workers. The reality is that migrants fill in labor shortages that are crucial to a lot of economic sectors in the US and other Western countries. And lower skilled migrants are actually incredibly important for a lot of vital sectors like agriculture, the whole food chain, from harvesting up to delivery, slaughterhouses, restaurants, cafes, and so on and so forth, the whole delivery sector, and the Amazons of the world. These sectors, they're completely dependent on migrant labor. Domestic work, obviously, things like that, cleaning. So everybody knows that. It's like an open secret. This is absolutely vital labor. We saw during COVID, right? These were the people showing up at your doorstep who didn't have the luxury to stay at home and actually run way higher risk. And there was a temporary, I think, reappreciation of those kind of workers that very rapidly fell away after COVID because it became so visible to us. So I think there is this huge state of denial in which we are. I don't think, the way I read the political narrative is as follows. First of all, I think it's very important to be aware of the huge gap between the narrative, the discourse, and the practice. And this is what we as migration researchers call the discursive gap. So we've measured...
Yeah, so when you look at, for instance, Trump's policies in his first administration, there really was no discontinuity on the ground, right, in terms of actual apprehensions or deportations or anything like that.
Actually, no other president deported as many migrants as Obama, actually. And legal migration reached an all-time high under Donald Trump, temporary admissions, H-1B, H-2B, all these sort of and other categories. Nobody knows that. Trump did not build a wall. Many Americans believe that. That already started in the late 1980s. He added a few pieces. But he's been very successful in projecting that image. And the proof is in the pudding, because it surprises me that many Americans actually believe that Trump built a wall, including on the left. So he's been very effective. So this is really where migration politics is about. So I make a difference between migration politics, which is the showmanship. And as long as politicians pull this off, and as long as there are no enough journalists to ask the critical question, underlying this narrative, what is the reality of the policy? Well, we measured it. And when we measured the evolution of migration policy, I did it with my team in Oxford, we measured 6,500 migration laws and regulations over the last decades in Western countries. We saw two patterns. First of all, immigration policy has not become more restrictive. Actually, we have opened more and more legal channels. You can clearly see that also in the US. Numbers of temporary admissions have really accelerated over the last 20 years. This is not about illegal migration. Illegal migration goes up and down, basically, but there is no clear pattern. And in terms of lower skilled migration, there is a huge hypocrisy. Because yes, it's true, we opened the doors particularly for skilled migration. The openness has been less for lower skilled migration, but at the same time, we tolerate undocumented migrants picking up all those jobs. I mean, the statistic that for me really proved this is that the number of employers that get prosecuted on an annual basis in a country like the US for illegally employing undocumented migrants was somewhere in the range between 15 and 20, which is roughly the same chance of being hit by lightning, I believe. So it shows there is no real willingness. And I already hear this from I was talking to somebody working for a recruiter for agricultural workers in California. Was saying, yeah, people are already complaining, growers, and they're sending signals to Capitol Hill like our workers are not showing up. We need those people to pick our lettuces and strawberries, and this is what you see time and again. So a lot of narrative, a lot of political show around deportations, but in reality, an economic system that relies on that labor, and that is what I call the organized political hypocrisy. And the last statistic that we found is that right-wing governments are not more restrictive on immigration than left-wing governments, because if the corporate lobby is strong in one party, it's the right wing. And they push really hard. You may talk tough on immigration, but don't push it too hard in reality.
Yeah, it's really weird how the rhetoric has shifted. I think the people who were most opposed to immigration in the past were unions and the party of the working class, right? Labor, let's say. And now it's kind of flipped where it's the populists on the right who are opposing immigration. But, when you look at the statistics, it seems like support for immigration is higher now than it ever has been. I was at a dinner with a bunch of folks who were in the tech sector, all of whom were immigrants back in 2017. And the topic was Donald Trump is anti-democratic, right? Because he opposes immigration. And I was like, well, hold on a second, right? The majority of Americans have opposed immigration ever since the Native Americans opposed the immigration of English people, right? And so, but this is really the only time in recent history where we've had an administration that explicitly seems to agree with that majority. When you hear Ronald Reagan talk about, immigration is the lifeblood of our country, I mean, he was really out of sync with the majority of the population. I mean, that was really an elitist view. So it seems like the employers have been able to dictate policy, but now we see this democratic, I guess, aversion to immigration finally rising into the public surface.
I mean, from that perspective, politicians have been very successful in deceiving their voters because they make the impression we're going to be tough. But in reality, I mean, it's already pretty clear, I think, that Elon Musk won the battle in terms of opening more visas for higher skilled workers to the US, because he's always been clear he's pro-immigration. Of course, more targeted on the skilled workers, and there is this hypocrisy I was just pointing out along lower skilled workers who are officially not welcome, but in practice tolerated massively in the US. And that is, of course, where you see a clash also in the Republican Party, also in the MAGA sort of world, between, let's say, the Millers, the cultural conservatives who really seem to be serious on shutting borders, and still, let's say, the Chamber of Commerce type of Republicans, people in business who don't want the borders to shut down because they rely on the labor. And that is the big conundrum that nobody can solve. So it provides the perfect circumstances for politicians to perform, on migration, all these symbolic acts that make the impression we're shutting the border. But in reality, I was just saying, migration reached an all-time high under Trump 1, and I don't expect things when if economic trends seem downward pretty much around the world, that will certainly slow down immigration. Of course, it's very attractive for an administration to then claim it was thanks to us. You see it also in Europe now. Asylum is going down because the civil war seems over in Syria, and the governments are the first to say, well, thanks to our border policies, although in practice not much changed. So I think that is really what politicians are into. They make an impression of being tough, but the reality is a very different one. Particularly, you could also reread this tough narrative. What happens if migrants are going to become scared of being deported? They're going to be even more anxious, and they will become even less likely to complain or denounce in case they get exploited by employers. So, but you don't solve a migration problem, you make those populations even more vulnerable to economic exploitation. And even if you build a perfect border wall, I mean, there's different estimates, but at least 40% of all documented migrants actually came in legally. So this is people overstaying their visas. And as long as there is this hypocrisy in not just America, but all Western societies, that we tolerate undocumented and also legal migrants, doing all sorts of jobs that nobody else wants to do, then this is never going to be solved.
Well, look, I know a lot of people who are sympathetic to this anti-immigration view, and they'll point to exploitation of public services. They'll say, oh, these folks come over and they utilize the free healthcare and they utilize the, free education for their kids. And, they get all sorts of benefits where they get welfare and food stamps and, free housing and so forth. Right. Why do people think that? Is there, what's the actual math? And if we were to think about the net kind of fiscal contribution, should we be thinking about it in an intergenerational sense? I mean, it seems like even if that first generation is not contributing much in the way of taxes, their children certainly will, and their grandchildren will certainly do even more, right?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, there's a lot of research on this. There is no evidence. There's a huge debate amongst economists, whether the impacts are slightly positive or slightly negative. But the point is the magnitude of the impact is so small that you can neither make a case about immigration is going to save our welfare system or they're going to bring it down. So you cannot really make that case. Of course, on a local level, I can imagine, if you have one particular town where all of a sudden I describe one case of a small town in, I think, Alabama, where suddenly, within the span of 10 years, you see a huge demographic shift. Of course, or places where lots of refugees will arrive. Of course, it can put pressure on local resources, but nationally or on a state level, you cannot really make that case. Ironically, actually, the fiscal balance is the most positive for undocumented migrants because they pay taxes but can generally not access public services. Of course, that may change over the life course, right? When migrants get kids, and those populations end up in marginalized positions. Of course, on the longer term, it can have also negative effects. But by and large, it all cancels each other more or less out. So you cannot really make that big case. But migrants contribute to corporate profits. We should not forget that, and particularly lower skilled migrants contribute hugely to corporate profits. But I do think
they also free up people to be more productive, right? So if you have childcare and you have healthcare and you have senior care and you have, housekeeping and gardening and all that stuff, these people then go and, earn more in their jobs, right?
No, so it's good for corporations. It's good for middle and upper class people for sure, because people either possess those corporations or have shares in those corporations that benefit from the labor that migrates. So most economic growth in the US over the last years has been due to immigration, actually. They just increase the overall size of the economic pie. They don't change average incomes much. It's not true that migration depresses wages, but it decreases the size of the economy, and it's particularly higher income earners that benefits from it. But from that perspective, it is totally conceivable that for low-income native workers to say, well, I don't see many benefits from immigration, but I do see my neighborhood changing. What's in it for me? And I think that's a valid case. So this is not about blaming migrants for structural problems like, price hikes, inflation, gas prices, lack of affordable housing, healthcare that's not functioning and things like that. That is much more to do with government policy, austerity policies, things like that. But I think it is fair to say that although immigration generally is not a major cause of all these problems, migration doesn't bring up crime. Actually, it rather brings it down. Migration doesn't bring down the welfare state. Migration is not the cause of growing job insecurity. That has much more to do with legal changes over the last 30 years. So economic policies, basically. But I think if you live in a neighborhood where migrants have totally changed the normal way of life over the last 10 or 20 years, and you don't see any economic benefits because the lowest income earners don't see any of these economic benefits of immigration, I think it is fair to say, yeah, what's in it for me? And I do think that pro-immigration elites have been blind to that sort of inequality of who benefits from immigration.
Now, you mentioned crime. So what about crime? I think there is a perception among a lot of voters, not only in the U.S., but also in Europe, that immigrants are criminals, right? Or have a higher proportion of criminals or lead to an increase in criminality, both sort of petty crime and also like terrorist type crime. I mean, is this perception simply a matter of the media sort of satisfying a demand for anti-immigrant hysteria? I mean, what do we know about crime and immigration?
Again, we have really good studies on, for instance, in the US, on the impact of immigration on crime. And overall, we see that immigrants, so foreign-born, bring down crime. Because migrants are a selected group of people. We talked about this before, right? They tend to be the more entrepreneurial people, generally not rich people, but certainly not the poorest of the poorest, people with certain ambitions, often quite conservative, often quite family-oriented. They want to help their families. They're in for the long haul, quite responsible people. And particularly undocumented migrants actually bring down crime because undocumented migrants want to do anything to not be caught by the police, obviously.
I think you said what I found interesting is second generation immigrants, become more like native-born Americans in a lot of ways, including they become more criminal.
Yes, and crime is particularly, and we know this more generally from criminology research. It is particularly, let's say, low social cohesion in communities combined with long-term unemployment that are conducive to crime as an alternative economic career. This is not. I'm not trying to justify crime, but it's just sociologically what we know about the circumstances that are conducive to crime. So if there is the association of immigration and crime, you actually talk about second generation groups that are marginalized. But again, studies that have tried to, econometrically measure, is there any separate factor other than education and income and unemployment and all these kind of factors that affect crime? So does, for instance, ethnicity, whether you're Mexican or Latino or Muslim, affect your crime rates? Not at all. You don't find any effect. So it's really about economic marginalization that is conducive and segregation that is conducive to crime. And when you talk about crime, you're not primarily talking here about violent crime because there is really no association between immigration and violent crime. We more talk about property crime, for instance. This is a real problem in communities where segregation has happened, not to be denied, but it has not so much to do with ethnicity, but much more to do with problems of segregation. And of course, media and politicians hugely magnify when it's a migrant who commits a crime. I mean, not that long ago in Sweden, a Swedish white person killed quite some immigrants, and that almost disappeared from our radars within one day. If that would have been a migrant, you know what the story would have been.
Well, I'm betting that the most controversial chapter in your book is the one on human trafficking. And it seems like people use human trafficking, human smuggling, and, illegal travel agency as sort of synonyms. And so, is that, what is behind that? I mean, why? I mean, it seems like people who are opposed to immigration are trying to portray immigrants as victims, and that we're really doing them a favor by preventing them from having access to these services. I mean, it seems like there must be some reality to the idea of trafficking, particularly of sex workers. But why do people use those terms interchangeably? And I mean, should we be talking about indentured servitude instead? Because it seems like most of there's a huge chunk of our ancestors in America that were indentured servants at one point because people had to borrow in order to facilitate their passage.
Exactly. Yeah, so I think that's a way better. There's a better way to put it. I mean, first of all, I think there's a huge conflation between two terms, trafficking and smuggling. And you see that a lot of the media and politicians. So if migrants make use of, let's say, facilitators, we generally talk about smuggling. This is really 95%, 99% of migrants. And smuggling is basically a service. So you sometimes get this image that people are almost forced across the border by smugglers, but the reality, we have a lot of really good smuggling research, is that, well, smugglers appear on stage on the moment that states try to block movement, and then migrants are going to pay a person to cross the border without being caught. It's very simple. So it is illegal, but it's a form of service delivery that migrants and refugees are generally quite happy to pay for, despite the risks it may create. Trafficking is a very different story. Trafficking actually, also the way it's defined, I think indentured servitude, where people can no longer escape, where they become so dependent on their employer, they can no longer escape situations of severe exploitation and maltreatment. I think that's where you can talk about trafficking. And I think you're spot on when you say it's much more indentured servitude. I think slavery is not the right word, but I think that's the right comparison. And it doesn't have to do with migration. So we actually know that most cases of trafficking have absolutely nothing to do with migration. So you talk about sex work and trafficking. Most known cases of trafficking in the US, for instance, in terms of sex work, is kids from very vulnerable homes that are being exploited by local pimps that become, in a way, traffickers at some point. They become in such vulnerable positions. So this is not to deny the severity of that problem. And these people, of course, need to be saved. These young women, for instance, end up in those situations. It's not only about sex work, also in other sectors we have trafficking. But if we start to label other migrants, or actually normal labor migrants, as victims of sex trafficking or victims of trafficking, and we start to liberate them, then they don't want to be liberated because they have invested thousands of dollars into their migration and they lose everything at once and they get deported. So this conflation between what I call normal labor migration and trafficking is leading to policy responses that actually make migrants more vulnerable. They don't help them. That's why some of the anti-traffic activists have this slogan: "Save us from our liberators," because you don't liberate people if you don't provide them another livelihood. And so this is not to deny that migrants are horribly exploited, but it was still a better deal than to stay at home. And for us then to say, well, you shouldn't come, then I think the only way to solve these issues is change the working circumstances more generally. That is the real solution. As long as we tolerate people doing those jobs and then creating these labor markets where we tolerate all sorts of labor, this is not going to stop. So this huge conflation between trafficking and smuggling, I think, is the biggest reason why we get this overall perspective that all these people are brought across borders and this is all shady international mafia. And actually most traffickers, most smugglers are just local operators. That's also what we know from research. There's this huge conflation also in the US that the drug cartel somehow are involved in smuggling. Actually, that's not what research shows.
And now there's we just saw the implementation of tariffs here in the United States. And, if there's a mismatch between where the jobs are and where the workers are, as you mentioned, there's two solutions. One is you bring the workers to the jobs. The other is you bring the jobs to the workers. But it seems like if we're going to impose tariffs, that makes it more difficult to bring the jobs to the workers. And so the only way to solve that is to have the workers come to the jobs. I mean, how can governments both advocate high tariffs and high immigration controls? I mean, it seems like you could do one or the other, but you can't do both.
No, I mean, NAFTA was very controversial at the time because the Clinton administration tried to sell it as a way to reduce migration from Mexico. It didn't really work out that way because we often forget the other side of NAFTA, that NAFTA drove many Mexican peasants out of business because of basically cheap US wheat exports and corn exports to Mexico. Let's not forget about that, right? We always look at one side of the equation, and many Mexican migration researchers have argued that actually led to a hump in migration to the United States in the decade following the implementation of NAFTA. So this is very complicated stuff indeed. And how this will pan out in the long term is difficult to predict. But I think the issue we continuously don't discuss is I think the only, let's put it differently. If a government is really serious about wanting to regulate migration, if a government would really be serious beyond the rhetoric, I want this better. I know that we cannot abolish migration. We cannot think it away. The illusion politics have failed us completely. We ended up with this broken immigration system. Everybody agrees on that. But the only way we can regulate migration is through our economic and particularly our labor market policies. As long as our governments are basically unwilling to check employers better, we already have the laws and the regulations. It's not that we need a whole bunch of new laws. We need to start implementing them. Labor inspectors are not doing, I'm not accusing them personally, but the labor inspection in across the West is not doing their job in preventing all these abuses. This is relevant for migrant and non-migrant workers, obviously. Unless we improve labor standards, you're not going to solve those problems. Unless you provide a better deal for US workers or European workers, you're never going to convince them to take up those jobs that migrants take up. And I think this shows to me that any serious debate about migration is really a broader debate about how do we want to organize our society, our economy. The US is also confronted now with plummeting birth rates. So aging is going to kick in even harder. And I'm not saying that migration is the solution, on the contrary, but it's going to be part of the story. And if we keep on denying the reality, we keep on having those policies that tend to backfire completely. And that's what we've seen over the last 40 years. Those policies haven't solved problems, they've made them worse. So I think it's really urgent we have a serious debate about how migration is entangled with things you were mentioning, like trade policy. You're right, it's going to have effects on migration. But whatever we do to the economy is going to have huge impacts as well.
Well, I think you've made the case for the establishment of something called migration science, right? Maybe this will be a new discipline, a new department. Hein, thanks so much for joining me. This book is called How Migration Really Works, and hope to continue to listen to your research.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. It was a pleasure.
unSILOed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.